They say that figures don't lie, but this graph may just be an exception. Let me explain. This is how most people think they operate when making decisions. They take all of the facts into consideration, weigh them up, make a logical conclusion, and then follow through with that. But in reality, our decision-making process looks more like this. We start off with whatever emotion we feel about something, which dictates what facts we pay attention to, how we interpret those facts, and then whether we follow through on them or not. And so, although this may look chaotic, there's actually an order to it. And by understanding that order, we can better predict how we're going to act. Let's consider this scenario. You're single and looking for a relationship, so you swipe on Tinder and you come across this profile. Now, the first thing you'll notice is her looks, which will evoke an emotional response from you. If you find her attractive, that will dictate what you do next. If you're not attracted to her, you'll probably just swipe away. But if you are, then you might read her bio, which could either reinforce your initial feelings or change them depending on what you read. And assuming you still like her at this point, you'll see that she likes skydiving. Now this presents you with two options. Option 1, match with her and message her. Or option 2, don't match with her because you don't like skydiving. The first option will lead to a conversation which will produce another emotional response. And depending on how that conversation goes, it will determine whether you want to meet up with her or not. Now, if we were to map out this process, it would look something like this. The horizontal axis represents our level of desire, and the vertical axis represents our level of logic. We start off with our initial emotional response to her looks. Then we apply some logic to that feeling, which results in our decision to either match with her or not. And if we do decide to match with her, then we get hit with another wave of emotion upon reading her bio. Again, we apply some logic to that, which determines whether we want to meet up with her or not. So at each step of this process, our emotions dictate our actions, which are then tempered by our ability to apply logic. So let's go back to that original graph. On the left, we have our emotions, which influence our thoughts and behaviors. And on the right, we have our logic, which is supposed to guide our behavior. But when making decisions, we don't utilize our logic first and then follow through. Instead, we use our emotions to gather and interpret the facts. If we want to follow through on those facts, we need to apply more logic to overcome the emotional resistance. Now, the reason why this matters is because it helps us predict how we're going to behave. For example, if you were faced with a risk that had a 1% chance of paying off, but a 99% chance of backfiring on you, would you take that risk? Statistically, you shouldn't. But what about if someone you loved was facing that same risk? Would you talk them out of it? Probably. Because even though your logic tells you that the risk isn't worth taking, your emotions tell you that it is, because it involves someone you care about. And so understanding this process helps us identify these biases in real time. For example, if we were trying to hire someone for a position, we might think that we're being objective and fair by posting the job online, reviewing the resumes, and then interviewing the candidates. But in reality, we're letting our emotions color how we perceive the candidates, whether that's their confidence, body language, or how well they fit in with the team. Our emotions are influencing who we hire, even though we think we're being totally objective. That's why having a diverse hiring panel can help mitigate this bias, because multiple people bring different emotional perspectives, which hopefully leads to a more balanced decision. Similarly, when it comes to our personal relationships, we might think that we're being rational when deciding whether to stay in a relationship or not. We weigh the pros and cons, the good times versus the bad times, and then come to a logical conclusion. But in reality, our emotions are coloring our interpretation of the facts. For example, we might convince ourselves that our partner isn't as bad as they seem, or that the good times were actually bad, and that we just didn't realize it at the time. One way to mitigate this bias in our personal lives is to write down our feelings about a situation and then revisit them after some time has passed. This gives us some distance from the situation, which allows us to be more objective and rational. It also helps us identify patterns in our thinking, such as always blaming ourselves or always blaming the other person. By becoming aware of these patterns, we can start to break them and make more rational decisions. Sometimes the facts are clear, but our emotions prevent us from acting on them. Like knowing that a relationship isn't right for us, but refusing to end it. Other times, the facts are unclear, and our emotions cause us to jump to conclusions, like mistaking lust for love or infatuation for commitment. The key takeaway here is that our emotions always come first. Logic is just an afterthought. That means that our desires drive our decisions, not our rational thoughts. And it also means that we should never trust someone who claims to be purely rational. No one is purely rational. We're all driven by our emotions. So given that we're emotional beings, wouldn't it be nice if we could understand how our brains process emotions? Turns out that we can. According to neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux, our brain processes emotions in 3 steps. First, there's an initial, quick emotional response that occurs in the lower, older part of our brain. Second, the midbrain starts to process the situation and formulates an appropriate response. Third, the higher, newer part of our brain evaluates the situation and makes a conscious decision about how to respond. And so our brain essentially has a hierarchy where the lower part controls the higher parts. Unfortunately, we can't access the lower part of the brain to decide how we react. Otherwise, we could simply choose to be rational all of the time. But what we can do is access the second and third parts of the brain, which allow us to evaluate the situation more objectively. For example, we can pause and reflect on how we're feeling and why we're feeling that way. This allows us to separate ourselves from our immediate emotional response and consider alternative ways of responding. In the long term, this trains our brain to be more rational because we reactively overriding the lower part of our brain. But the question becomes, what if we've already made a decision based on our emotions? Can we become more rational at that point? Well, according to a study by Harvard Business School professor Brené Brown, once we've made a decision, our brain doesn't allow us to be rational about it anymore. That's because our brain is wired to justify our actions. Here's how that works. When we make a decision, our brain releases a chemical called dopamine, which reinforces the neural connections related to that decision. The more we think about the decision, the more dopamine is released, which makes us feel good about ourselves. So at that point, it's very difficult to be rational about the decision because our brain is emotionally invested in it. In fact, our brain will go to great lengths to justify our decisions, even if they're wrong. For example, if we buy a stock that goes down in value, our brain will convince us that it's a long-term investment and that now is not the time to sell. Even if our emotions told us to sell in the first place, our brain will come up with a reason why that emotion isn't relevant. The only way to override this bias is to force yourself to be rational about your decision. For example, if you bought a stock that's lost 50% of its value, you need to ask yourself, would you buy that stock today knowing that it's already lost 50%? If the answer is no, then you should sell it. Our brain doesn't want to admit that it made a mistake, so we'll try to make the mistake seem bigger than it actually is. And so when we face losses, we tend to hold on to them for too long, because our brain wants to justify the loss rather than admit that it made a mistake. That's why it's important to have a plan for when to cut your losses. You won't be thinking rationally when you actually have to execute on that plan. But if you have a plan in place, you can follow it without having to think about it. As the old saying goes, a bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. But as humans, we often fall victim to the sunk cost fallacy, where we hold on to things that are losing us money, time, or energy, simply because we've already invested in them. And until we understand how our brain works, we'll continue to be slaves to our emotions.